saving. Saving is simply disposable income less consumption. Simple. In other words, saving is income not consumed. Ignore this for a second. The paradox of thrift is interesting because the more we save must obviously mean the less we consume. But we know from our expenditure equation that if the lower C is, the lower GDP is. So if we decrease C, we decrease GDP in the short run. That's bad. But savings is required for investments, which we shall see in our aggregate expenditure model in a moment. And investment is required to increase GDP in what I like to call the very long run, which is good. Investment increases GDP. So therefore savings is good, but savings is bad. That's the paradox. What do we do? It's a paradox for a reason. We don't have an answer. Right. So if we have savings, we have a savings function. We have the marginal propensity to save is the slope of the savings function. The slope of the savings function must, by necessity, be 1 minus the slope of the consumption function. The marginal propensity to save will tell us how saving changes if income changes. If the marginal propensity to consume is 60%, in other words, we save 60% of the additional income we earn, our marginal propensity to save must be 40%, right? If we consume 60%, we must be saving 40%. In other words, the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus B. If we look at a savings function, right, we're saying that the savings function is directly linked to the consumption function. If our marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, our marginal propensity to save must be 0.25. In other words, if income changes by 200, saving will change by 0.25 times 200, which is 50. In other words, if income changes by 200, we will consume 150 and save 50. Of course, when our income is 0, if we are consuming some positive amount, we must be saving some negative amount. In other words, negative A. If we shift our consumption function up, in other words, we change our our y-intercept on our consumption function, in other words, A goes up, well, our savings function must go down, and our y-intercept on our savings function must become lower. What I've done is put a whole bunch of videos here, and it looks a bit funny at the moment because they're still busy doing their thing and I got a little bit over waiting for them. So anyway, those videos are there. When you click on the mind map, they'll look better than that, and alternatively, go and watch those videos. They are all on our website, on the course website. Right, moving on to investment. When we talk about investment, we're not talking about shares and stocks on a stock exchange. We're talking about investment made by firms. When firms invest, they buy machines or factories, or they put some of their stock away. We call that inventory. So these are all forms of investment. And investment is driven by the rate of return. And it's the rate of return versus the real interest rate. So the decision made by firms is to say the following: if I can make an investment and my rate of return, in other words, the return on my investment is 10%, and I need to borrow money, and I pay 5%, so the real interest rate is 5%, and I pay 5% for borrowing that money. If I earn 10%, I need to pay 5% in order to borrow the money. I'm making a positive real return after interest payment of 5%. Of course, if my rate of return is less than my real interest rate, then I won't invest. So if we look at a diagram, what we're saying is that investment, right, the quantity of investment demanded, is inversely related to the expected rate of return and the real interest rate. The higher the real interest rate, the less I am going to want to borrow, because the less investments I'm going to find that have a real interest rate higher, have a real rate of return higher than the real interest rate which I need to spend in order to borrow. Whereas the lower the real interest rate, right, the higher my investment, my quantity demanded, my quantity of investment demanded. What this means, though, is that if investment depends on the interest rate, it does not depend on GDP. So investment, therefore, will have a perfectly elastic slope. Again, it is an autonomous variable in our equation. It does not depend on y. So, what then will shift our investment curve? Well, anything that affects the return. So therefore, maintenance or operating costs, any business taxes which reduce the profits from our investment and therefore decrease the return, any technological change which makes it either more or less worthwhile for me to do the intended investment, and of course expectations about the future. The interesting thing about investment is the financing of investment. Now, if we break down our income according to the expenditure approach, whereby income or expenditure equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and we also consider a household, right, what it does with its income, it can either consume it, or it can save it, or it goes to taxes, right? Then if this is all the income, if this is what can happen to income in our economy, and this is what happens when it's spent, and we equate these two equations, then we get I plus G plus X minus M equals S plus T. Okay, so we just cancel off the two C's. We rearrange to give I, and we see that I is financed either through savings or from tax, or should we say unspent taxes, taxes not spent by the government, or from outside of the world. In other words, we borrow money from outside of the world. The value of our imports is greater than our exports, then we are borrowing money from the rest of the world. So investment is either financed through savings or through surplus taxes or through surplus borrowings from the rest of the world. Right. That brings us to our expenditure model.